I was reminded this week, reading the lesson that we just heard, of how different John's gospel is from the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all have basically the same overall narrative, but the way that storytelling works in John is very different from the storytelling in the other gospels. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are very similar in terms of their narrative form, the basic form of Jesus' teaching is parables, the telling of parables. And parables, you probably know, have a kind of basic structure. They're typically very short stories or vignettes. They're often based on just everyday experience. They usually have a fairly simple point at the end, but in the process, there's a twist, there's a surprise. There's something that makes you say, oh, I didn't see that coming. So, for example, in the story of the prodigal son who's wasted his life and gone off and done everything horrible, comes back to the dad, and we expect, the dad is going to chastise this kid. But instead, he makes him a feast. Oh, I didn't see that coming. In John's gospel, there are no parables. Instead, there's a very different form of storytelling, and we heard a wonderful example this morning. John uses these extended dialogues in which Jesus has a conversation with people that he encounters along the way. Often a single person, as we heard last week in the story of meeting the woman at the well. And sometimes a kind of big group discourse, as we heard this morning in this story of the man born blind. And there are a couple of interesting things about these dialogues, this kind of storytelling. I think it's very appealing in a very human way because, we read these stories and it's as if we're listening in to a real conversation that we might actually hear people talking about. This dialogue of Jesus with the woman at the well, we think, oh, that might actually have happened. I can imagine that happening. But there's always in these stories a secret to understanding them. And John makes clear, if you have the secret knowledge of the meaning of the story, then you can really understand it. So with the story of the woman at the well, the woman at the well doesn't really understand what he's talking about. Living water? Where did we get this living water? Are you talking about fresh water? I don't get it. We know, because we have the secret knowledge, that Jesus is really talking about the Spirit, the water as a symbol of the Spirit. And in this story that we heard this morning, the story of the man born blind, which seems to be an argument about, was he already blind? No, he wasn't already blind. Does he actually see now? How did this work? The secret understanding that we have is this isn't really about being blind or being able to see, except at a spiritual level. It's really about being able to see the truth and understanding reality. And John makes very effective use of irony in these stories. The irony in the story of the woman at the well is that it's not the Jews who accept Jesus' call, but it's Samaritans, the Jews' hated enemies. They're the ones who actually listen and respond to Jesus, and not the people who should be responding, which is the Jews. And in this story this morning, of the man born blind, the irony is that the people who should be able to see, understand the truth about God, the Pharisees, are completely blind. And it's only the man born blind who can actually see the truth. And I love the line that he has kind of towards the end. And he's clearly very exasperated. I mean, it's a very human encounter. You've got a bunch of different characters. You've got Jesus, the man born blind. You've got his parents. You've got the Pharisees. And again, the way that they respond seems very human. The parents are like, well, don't ask me. I don't have, and don't get me involved in this. And the man is obviously, by the end of this, he's getting very exasperated. And he's the one who really comes out with this blunt observation. Never before in the history of the world has someone opened the eyes of a blind man. Don't you get it? Well, people often think of John's gospel as the most spiritual gospel, because John does have these big themes, symbolic themes that run throughout his gospel. Light and darkness, water and spirit, bread and wine, truth and lies. And it's also true that in John's gospel, Jesus is presented as a divine figure, really from the very beginning, from the beginning of the gospel. And he's explicitly called Son of God, which is a label that the other gospels use very rarely. Furthermore, Jesus refers to himself using the name of God, I am. I am the living water. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. The repeated use of that throughout the gospel. So I might say John's really emphasizing the divinity of Jesus, that he is this kind of divine figure who's come down from heaven to walk among human beings. But I don't think that's how John wants us to understand Jesus. Because John's gospel is actually deeply rooted in the physical landscape of Israel. There are constant references to real places that John names and these encounters that Jesus has. Cana in Galilee, the pool of Bethesda, Jacob's well, the pool of Siloam, which is what we heard about, referred to this morning, which is a real place. You can go visit in Jerusalem today. They're still excavating it. And think about how physical this healing process of the blind man is. It's not just he waves his hand and everything's better. You know, he spits on the ground and then he makes a paste out of the mud of the ground and the spittle and smears it on the man's eyes. Such a physical action. So it's as if, we're meant to understand Jesus has all these encounters with real people, and he's a real person too, and he has all of the same emotions that real people have. And this is emphasized again in John. He experiences fear. He experiences frustration. He experiences anger and sorrow and joy. So John is really, I think, trying to tell us the truth is right in front of your eyes, literally. But it's a hidden truth. Some people can understand it, but other people cannot. That's what we hear very clearly in this lesson. And in order to understand it, you have to have the key. And the key is having a relationship with the human Jesus. Because what John is telling us is God's true nature is revealed through Jesus' humanity. Now we're coming up on Holy Week. Holy Week's in a couple of weeks. And it's in Holy Week that we experience Jesus at his most human, and therefore, John tells us, at his most divine. And as he goes through this experience of suffering and desperation and sadness and confusion, experiencing all the things that human beings experience, we know that he is in that process revealing God's true nature. And at that moment on the cross, that's when we're able to see God most clearly in the crucified Christ. It's not in the resurrection. It's on the cross that God is revealed. And Jesus tells his followers, even before they arrive at Jerusalem, that truth when he says, "When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself." When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself, meaning on the cross. So it's as if when we see Jesus on the cross, in this moment of deepest human darkness, suddenly there's a light that flashes in front of our eyes and pierces our heart. And we say, "Now I see, now I understand." Amen.